Rebecca Bernadette Purcell was born on November 19, 1981, in Quincy, Illinois, to her parents, Bernadette and William, and she also had one sister named Sarah. Rebecca, or Becky, as she was called, attended Payson Seymour Elementary School, followed by Quincy Notre Dame High School, where she was actually named valedictorian. She then attended Quincy University, where she graduated cum laude with a bachelor's degree in biological science and a minor in chemistry. Becky was super smart and very driven. Now, it was here in college where she met the man that she would eventually marry and start a family with. His name, Tim Bliefnick. He was a football player at Quincy University, and he and Becky had become friends over the years. But friends were really all they were until about 2 years after graduating, at which point they did start dating. They decided to move in together, they eventually got married, and then they started having children. Now, before she became a mom, Becky actually worked as a very successful pharmaceutical sales rep. But after having her first son, the two of them decided that she would stay home and Tim would continue working. And for the first 5 years or so of their marriage, they seemed to be pretty happy. But in that time, Becky and Tim had one son, and then they had another son. That was up until Becky decided that she wanted to go back to school and become a nurse. This is the point where she said that things began to change in their marriage. And that's because Tim started to become more manipulative and controlling. When Becky decided to go to nursing school, everyone in her life was super supportive of her, except for her husband, Tim. When Becky was in nursing school, she found out that she was pregnant with her third son, and she only missed 1 day of school during her pregnancy. During the pandemic, she was a traveling nurse, and that same year she was awarded the Daisy Award. Now, the Daisy Award comes from the Daisy Foundation, which is a nonprofit that honors nurses who excel in clinical care and compassion. And receiving this award means the honorary has made an impact in the lives of a patient, a family, or even a colleague, and can open a lot of doors and opportunities. This includes reduced tuition to nurses looking to further their education, the ability to apply for grants that only recipients of the award are eligible to apply for, and more. But like I just mentioned, things really started to go downhill in her marriage with Tim after she started nursing school. Becky's sister Sarah said that Tim just stopped supporting her during this time and, quite frankly, didn't help with the boys even though she was busier than ever. Sarah also says that around this time, Becky had tried to get Tim to go to marriage counseling with her, and he refused. And in January of 2021, after 11 years of marriage, Tim actually was the one who filed for divorce, which kicked off a very bitter and contentious divorce battle. And the 3 big things that they fought over, which are pretty typical in divorce proceedings, were money, the house, and the kids. And from what I can tell, neither were willing to give in to the other. And things escalated pretty quickly. Just a few months after the divorce papers were filed, Becky started confiding in her friends about Tim's behavior, and it was not good. She talked about how he was acting abusive, that he would scream in her face that he had shoved her in front of the kids and threw things at her. In one text, she wrote, "Tim has serious mental health problems, and he is becoming more vengeful and unpredictable." And then in another text, and this one was to her sister, and by far the most serious, she wrote, "If something ever happens to me, please make sure the number one person of interest is Tim, as that is who would do something to me. I'm putting this in writing that I am fearful he will somehow harm me, come after me, or will try to do something to me that takes me away from the kids, or the kids away from me. He has already lied multiple times to paint himself as the victim and me as the perpetrator when it is absolutely the other way around." Becky had sent this text to her sister not long after a coworker of hers was murdered by their partner, and this was obviously a massive eye-opener to her. On September 1st, 2021, Tim had filed for an order of protection against Becky, citing that she had been harassing him and stalking him. The judge did not grant the order of protection. However, shortly after this, Becky filed her own order of protection against him. In her petition, she accused him of repeatedly entering her home without permission, using their children to gain access to the house and more. However, once again, the judge did not grant this order of protection either, and Her loved ones believe that that's because the court saw her application as sort of gamesmanship, rather than a legitimate attempt to get protection from someone that she was growing increasingly scared. However, the judge did order for the two of them to stay away from each other's residences unless they were dropping off the kids. The judge also ordered that Tiernan a 9mm gun that Becky had given him. However, spoiler alert, that gun was never returned. So, for the next year and a half, Becky and Tim continued to argue over the things that I mentioned earlier: the money, the house, and the kids. As 2023 approached, though, things seemed like they were eventually going to come to an end, because there was a divorce trial scheduled for early March, and this would hopefully be the end of a 2.5-year battle. But that trial never ended up happening, and Becky never got the opportunity for closure, because on February 23rd, 2023, Becky was senselessly murdered inside her own home. That day, after Becky's dad received a text from Tim saying that he hadn't been able to get a hold of her. Becky's dad drove over to her house to see if she was there, and she was there, but not at all how he expected to find her, because Becky had been shot to death in her bathroom, surrounded by an amount of blood. As you can imagine, he called 911 immediately, and officers with the Quincy Police Department, as well as the Adams County State's Attorney's Office, arrived on scene, and they instantly started investigating. And it didn't take them long to realize that whoever had broken into the house and killed Becky had done so by prying open a window on the second floor. It looked like they had climbed up on a patio chair to gain access, and tool marks on the window showed that it had been pried open with what they eventually determined was a crowbar. And because there was nothing in the house to suggest that anything was stolen, it was obvious that this was not a robbery gone wrong. Whoever had broken into Becky's house did so with the intention to kill her, and they succeeded. But she was shot a total of 14 times, and the medical examiner says that she was alive for each and every one of them. And the scene itself was proof of a violent struggle, one where Becky's bedroom door was physically kicked in. And it's at this point during the struggle that investigators believe that Becky had tried to call 911, but she didn't even have the chance. And as for the rest of the evidence collected at the scene, investigators found a partial shoe print, 8 spent shell casings from a 9mm handgun, as well as a bunch of small pieces of plastic surrounding her body. There was a neighbor who had a security camera, and that footage ended up being incredibly useful. As soon as the investigation kicked off, officers with the Quincy Police Department canvassed the neighborhood and, of course, went around asking neighbors for any security footage they may have. So many people have just security cameras and Ring doorbells, so they wanted to collect as much of that as they could. And it was in one of those conversations with the couple that lived directly next door to Becky that uncovered a lot.
Does it record?
It records movement. So anytime it senses movement, it will notify us on our phones.
That one in the middle of the night and texted Becky immediately. I told her we just saw somebody in the driveway, and she responded not till the next morning.
And what did she say when she responded?
That's when she told me that she hadn't seen anything, but she thought she had been hearing voices in her backyard and her motion light go on, and she was very paranoid.
It turns out they had a security camera that recorded footage of their driveway, which ran right alongside Becky's driveway. And even though it didn't pick up anything from the night of the murder, it picked up something very interesting from the night before. At 1:05 a.m., a person was seen walking down Becky's driveway towards the back of her house. Then 48 minutes later, that same person is seen walking away in the direction that they had come from. And that wasn't the only instance. About a week earlier, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, the security camera picked up almost the exact same thing. And what's interesting about this time is that the neighbor was actually awake when she got the notification that someone was detected by the camera. So she actually ended up texting Becky right away, explaining that someone had just walked towards the back of her house, but she didn't get a response until the next morning. Now, Becky said that she didn't actually see anything. It was most likely Becky's killer looking for an opportunity or, staking out the scene to make a plan to carry out what they later would. So, with this, investigators decided to conduct an even broader search of surveillance footage because if one camera captured this person on tape, there was bound to be more. 2 additional cameras in the area captured what appeared to be an individual riding a bike in the direction of Becky's house, just before the person from the neighbor's security camera was seen walking down her driveway. Then the cameras captured the same biker riding away from Becky's house shortly after. That person was seen leaving her driveway. So every time someone was seen biking towards her house, someone was then seen walking down her driveway shortly after. And every time someone was seen leaving her driveway, someone was seen biking in the opposite direction shortly after. However, for as useful as that footage seemed, there was one big problem. The footage was very low quality, and it is impossible to make out who this person is. You can't even really tell if it's a man or a woman. The only detail they could really figure out was that the bike didn't have reflectors on the wheels, but that's it. But, of course, they weren't entirely in the dark about who this person could be, who the suspect in this case could be, because Sarah, Becky's sister, immediately had her hunch about who could have done this, and she didn't hesitate to let investigators know. Sarah and her husband, Brett, were on vacation when they first got the call about Becky's murder, and they flew to Illinois as soon as they could. When they got the news, they believed there was only one person who could have done this, and that person was Tim. And once investigators learned the details about their contentious divorce and the upcoming trial, and the fact that Tim only lived 1 mile from her house, they felt strongly that he could have been involved in this plus. When investigators first spoke with him, he said that he was at home that night with his sons, who were asleep in their rooms. He also mentioned that Becky had asked him to keep the boys an extra night, which he agreed to. As I mentioned earlier, the judge had ordered Tim to return a 9mm handgun that Becky had gifted him during their marriage, and he did not return it because he claimed he didn't know where it was. And like I also just stated, Becky was killed with a 9mm gun. A search warrant was executed on Tim's house, and among the items that were seized was a box full of shell casings that had been found in his basement. And when the shell casings from Tim's basement were tested and the shell casings from the scene were tested, investigators learned that 27 from the basement had been fired from the exact same gun. So in total, there were 54 shell casings found in his basement, and 27 of them matched the 8 that were found at the crime scene. Before investigators even executed the search warrant, they found a bike with no reflectors on the wheels, abandoned in a bush less than a half block away from Tim's house. And if you remember, the bike on the surveillance footage didn't have reflectors on the wheels. And so they believed it was possible that this could have been that bike. So of course they collected this bike as evidence and started the process of trying to figure out where it came from and who it belonged to. But at this point, there was enough evidence to make an arrest. On March 13th, 2023, just 2 weeks after Becky was killed, Tim Bliefnick was arrested in her murder and held without bond. But Tim's arrest hit the media quick and it started to gain a lot of traction. And this is the reason why in 2019, just 2 years before the murder, Tim was actually a contestant on the very popular game show Family Feud with his side of the family. Tim ended up accepting his right to a speedy trial, which meant that the prosecutors had 90 days from the time of his arrest to present this case to a jury. And on May 23, 2023, exactly 3 months after the murder, his murder trial began. His defense attorney said that it was dripping in reasonable doubt. If you remember from earlier, I mentioned that when they found Becky's body, there were also tiny pieces of plastic found around her body. When they executed a search warrant of Tim's house and figured out exactly what those pieces of plastic were, it turns out that they were fragments of reusable Aldi shopping bags, which Tim had actually kept stacks of inside his home. But anyway, the reason they believe they were ripped up and scattered around Becky's body is because, according to prosecutors, Tim used the bags in an attempt to either 1, try and trap the shell casings after firing the gun through it, or 2, try to muffle the sounds of the gunshots. Either way, though, they believe he placed the handgun inside of the bags and fired through them, hence the plastic that had been blown off the bags. And then there was the DNA on one of these pieces of plastic. An expert testified for the prosecution, saying that it was more likely than not that Tim was a contributor to the DNA that was found on those pieces of plastic, which sounds pretty damning. However, Tim's attorney would argue that he and Becky constantly used these bags to transport their kids' stuff back and forth, so she argued that his DNA on there didn't mean much. And the same goes for DNA that was found under Becky's fingernails. When they did the autopsy, they did find DNA under her fingernails, and it was a match to Tim. When Tim's home was searched, investigators found a crowbar, which is the tool that they believe Becky's killer used to gain access to her through that upstairs window. And when it was tested, the crowbar from his basement was said to have consistencies with the mark left behind on that second-floor window. However, these consistencies were microscopic, which didn't make it a super solid piece of evidence. But the thing the prosecution was trying to explain was that it wasn't one small thing that was going to prove Tim did this, but rather a combination of things that pointed to his guilt. Take, for example, his cell phone search history. The prosecution presented to the jury several examples of searches that Tim had made on his phone. This includes how to open a door with a crowbar, ? How to clean gunpowder off your hands, ? How to make a homemade pistol silencer, ? Google search. But there was no time or date of when these searches were made, and so the defense obviously argued that these could have been made after the murder. But the searches don't end there. Earlier I mentioned that someone was seen on surveillance walking down Becky's driveway about a week before the murder on February 14th. Well, shortly after this person left the area of Becky's house, Tim made over 200 online searches for a very specific license plate and VIN number, and these searches were date and time stamped. So they know for a fact that these were made as soon as that person was seen leaving Becky's house on the 14th. Prosecutors say that they believe they can connect Tim to the person on surveillance because on the night of the 14th, a truck was parked in her driveway, and it was that truck's license plate and VIN number that Tim was searching for more than 200 times, and this truck belonged to a man that Becky was dating. So prosecutors believe what's pretty obvious, that he saw the truck, and then he wrote down the license plate and VIN number and spent the next several hours trying to look it up online. As I explained, there were tons of small pieces linking Tim to the murder, and the jury ultimately found him guilty after 6 days of trial. Tim Bliefnick was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of home invasion. On August 11th, 2023, Tim returned to court for his sentencing hearing, and thankfully, in the end, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tim, of course, still says he's innocent. Thank you very much for watching us. To support us, please subscribe to our channel and like this video, and be sure to comment your opinions. We will see you soon with another video.